The first snow came early that year, soft at first, then heavy and relentless, turning the valley white before most folks were ready for it. By dawn, smoke rose from the chimneys of sturdy ranch houses, but at the edge of the pine woods, there was one small cabin with no smoke at all. It sat alone near a frozen creek, its roof bowed with age, its windows patched with cloth and paper. Inside that cabin, every morning before the sun fully rose, a young schoolteacher named Clara Whitfield wrapped herself in a wool shawl, stamped her feet to bring back feeling, and prepared to teach. The cabin had once been a trapper's shelter. It was never meant to be a school. The logs didn't fit tight, and the wind slipped through the cracks like a living thing. When the storms came, the walls groaned, and the door rattled on its hinges. There was no stove, no fireplace, only a small iron lantern that Clara kept lit during lessons, more for hope than for warmth. Her breath fogged the air as she wrote letters on a slate board, her fingers stiff and red. The children arrived in ones and twos, bundled in coats too thin for the weather, boots patched and mended many times. They came from scattered homesteads miles apart, trudging through snowdrifts because their parents believed learning was worth the cold. Clara greeted each child with a smile that never showed how numb her hands were. She believed it wasn't their burden to carry. Clara had come to the valley just before winter. She was young, with dark hair she kept pinned neatly back and eyes that held both determination and kindness. The town council had offered her the teaching post with an apology instead of a salary fit for comfort. There was no proper schoolhouse yet, they said, but maybe next year. Until then, there was the old cabin. She accepted without complaint. She'd grown up poor herself and knew what it meant to make do. Each day followed the same rhythm. Lessons began with reading, then writing, then arithmetic. The children huddled close together, sharing what little warmth their bodies could give. When the cold became unbearable, Clara would have them stand and recite, stamping their feet as if it were part of the lesson. She turned hardship into routine, routine into resilience. Word of the freezing cabin spread slowly, as such things do in rural places. Most people shook their heads and muttered about how it was a shame, but no one seemed able to spare the money or time to fix it. Winter was hard on everyone. One morning, as Clara was helping a small boy sound out a difficult word, she noticed a tall figure standing just outside the door. Snow clung to his coat and hat, and his boots were thick with frost. He didn't knock at first, just watched quietly through the gap in the door. The children noticed him too and grew restless. Finally, he rapped his knuckles once against the wood. Clara looked up, startled, then walked over and opened the door. A blast of cold air rushed in. "Yes?" she asked. The man removed his hat. He was broad-shouldered, with weathered skin and eyes that looked like they'd seen many seasons. "Name's Thomas Hale," he said. "I own the ranch west of here. Heard there was a school in this cabin." Clara nodded. "You heard right. Would you like to come in?" He hesitated, glancing at the children. "Don't want to interrupt." "You're not," she said. "Please." He stepped inside, his presence filling the small room. He frowned as he looked around, the thin walls, the children's blue-tinged fingers, the lantern flickering uselessly against the cold. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing at first. Clara returned to the lesson, though she could feel his eyes on her the whole time. When the children began copying sums onto their slates, Thomas spoke again. "How do you keep this place warm?" She smiled, a little embarrassed. "We don't, really. We keep each other warm enough." Thomas didn't answer. He simply nodded and stood by the door until the lesson ended. When the children finally bundled up and left, he remained. "That's no way to teach," he said quietly. "It's the only way we have," Clara replied. "And it's enough." He looked at her, really looked at her, as if weighing her words. Then he said, "It's not enough. Not for you. Not for them." The next morning, Clara arrived at the cabin before sunrise as usual. To her surprise, Thomas was already there. A wagon stood nearby, loaded with tools, iron parts, and bricks. He greeted her with a brief nod. "I'm building you a stove," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Clara stared. "You can't just, this isn't." "I can, and I will," he interrupted gently. "If you'll let me." She hesitated, pride warring with gratitude. Finally, she stepped aside. "All right," she said softly. "But I can't pay you." He smiled faintly. "Didn't ask you to." For the next several days, Thomas worked from dawn until dusk. He hauled bricks, cut iron piping, and fitted everything carefully inside the cramped cabin. The children watched with wide eyes, asking questions and offering clumsy help. Thomas answered them patiently, showing them how the stove worked, explaining why heat rose and how smoke needed a proper vent. In his own way, he was teaching too. Clara tried to protest when he returned day after day, but he waved her off. "Someone ought to do something," he said. "Might as well be me." By the end of the week, the stove was finished. Thomas lit it himself, feeding and kindling and then logs. Slowly, warmth spread through the cabin. The children gasped as feeling returned to their fingers. Clara felt tears sting her eyes as she realized she could feel her toes again. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas just nodded. "Thought I might stay," he said. "If you don't mind. See what lessons look like when you're not freezing." So he stayed. He sat at the back of the room on a rough bench, his large frame oddly careful not to take up too much space. At first, the children were distracted, but soon they settled back into their work. Thomas listened, fascinated, as Clara explained fractions and grammar, history, and geography. He'd never had much schooling himself. His childhood had been spent working land, not reading books. Day after day, he returned. He fixed small things around the cabin, a loose board, a drafty window, without being asked. He brought extra firewood. Sometimes he brought apples or bread for the children. And always, he stayed for the lessons. Clara began to notice him answering questions under his breath, following along with the readings. Once, when she asked a question and no child answered, Thomas raised his hand hesitantly, like a schoolboy himself. The children laughed, but she smiled and nodded for him to speak. As winter deepened, the cabin became a place of warmth and learning, a small island of light against the snow. Clara's teaching grew stronger now that her body wasn't fighting the cold. She laughed more. The children learned faster. Even Thomas seemed to change, his stern face softening as he discovered the joy of understanding things he'd never been taught. One evening, after the children had gone, Thomas lingered by the stove. "You know," he said, staring into the fire, "I never learned to read proper. I can make out words, but slowly." Clara looked at him. "Would you like to learn?" He hesitated, then nodded. "If it's not too much trouble." She smiled. "It would be a pleasure." So the lessons continued, even after the school day ended. Clara taught Thomas his letters again, patiently, without judgment. He learned quickly, driven by a quiet determination. Sometimes he grew frustrated, but she encouraged him, reminding him that learning was not a race. By the time spring arrived, the snow began to melt, and the valley changed color. The creek thawed, birds returned, and the cabin no longer felt so isolated. Word spread of what Thomas had done, and other ranchers began to help. Plans for a real schoolhouse took shape. On the last day of the term, the children presented Clara with a small gift, a book they'd all signed their names in. Thomas stood at the back, pride shining in his eyes. As the children left one final time, Clara turned to him. "I couldn't have done this without you," she said. He shook his head. "You did it long before I showed up. I just added a stove." She laughed softly. "You added warmth in more ways than one." They stood there together, the fire crackling gently, the cabin no longer freezing, no longer lonely. Outside, the valley stretched wide and hopeful, and inside, lessons lingered, not just of reading and numbers, but of kindness, perseverance, and the quiet power of showing up when it matters most.